In October of 2025, on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, a team of archaeologists cleared the last of the earth from a standing stone that had been buried for 11,000 years. And when they brushed it clean and turned it toward the light, they found a face staring back at them. Not a symbol, not a pattern, not the abstracted line and curve geometry that characterizes most Neolithic art. A face, a human face. Deep-set eyes beneath a heavy brow, a sharp jawline, a broad nose, carved into the flat top of a T-shaped pillar, the kind of monolith that had been found by the hundreds across this ancient landscape, but never before with this. A portrait. A person looking out across a span of time so vast and so silent that it makes the pyramids seem recent, makes Stonehenge seem modern, makes the entire recorded history of human civilization seem like a brief afterthought. Professor Necmi Karul, who leads the excavation, said something worth holding on to. He said that this was a person from the Neolithic age carving themselves into stone, that it was an act of self-expression so old it predates every written language, every kingdom, every city that has ever existed. And this face was found not in a temple, not in a palace. It was found in a room that still contained grinding stones, the kind used to process wild grain. A room where someone once lived, where someone once ate, where someone once looked at this pillar every morning and saw a face they recognized. Now, let that settle. Close your eyes if you haven't already. You don't need to see anything tonight. You don't need to be anywhere. The story will carry you. It moves slowly, the way old things do, and wherever you drift is exactly where you're meant to be. If you fall asleep before the end, that's not failure. That's the whole point. You can come back tomorrow night. The stones will still be here. They've been waiting for 11,000 years. They can wait a little longer, so let's go there together. To a ridge in the Tek Mountains, in the southeastern corner of Turkey, where the land rises gently from the Harran Plain, and the air smells of dust and dry herbs and the faintest memory of rain. To a place called Karahan Tepe, to a question that doesn't have an easy answer, and maybe that's what makes it worth asking. The landscape of southeastern Turkey is not what most people imagine when they think of the ancient Near East. There are no lush river valleys here, no broad green floodplains stretching toward the horizon. The Tek Mountains are dry and rolling, a series of limestone ridges that rise gently from the Harran Plain, their flanks covered in scrub and thin soil that turns to dust in summer and briefly, greens after the autumn rains. The nearest city of any size is Şanlıurfa, ancient Edessa, a place that has been holy ground for nearly as long as anyone can remember. It sits roughly 46 kilometres to the west. Between the city and the site, the roads thin out. Pavement gives way to gravel, then to dust. There are no signs, or at least there were none for a very long time. The ridge where Karahan Tepe sits is located within the boundaries of the Tek Mountains National Park, near a small settlement called Yağmurlu. The locals have their own name for the hill, Civilisation, the Hill of the Goats, and for centuries, perhaps millennia, that is all it was. A place where herders grazed their flocks and moved on. But this landscape was not always so austere. Geological evidence tells a different story. During the last ice age, and in the long warming that followed, this region was wet. Profoundly wet. Rivers cut through what are now dry valleys. The hills were forested with pistachio and almond and wild oak, their canopies alive with birdsong. The Harran Plain, which today is one of the most intensively farmed flatlands in Turkey, was then a patchwork of grassland and marsh, teeming with wild game. Aurochs grazed in herds so large they would have darkened the hillsides. Vast wild cattle, the bull standing over 1.7 metres at the shoulder, with forward-curving horns that could span a metre from tip to tip. Gazelle moved in seasonal migrations across the plain, their paths worn into the earth by centuries of passage. Wild boar rooted in the thickets along watercourses that no longer exist. Onager, the wild ass of Western Asia, ran in small herds across the steppe. Cranes gathered in enormous flocks at the seasonal wetlands, their calls carrying for kilometres in the clear air. And above them all, watching from the rock outcrops and the edges of the tree line, the Anatolian leopard, the apex predator of this world, silent, patient, and utterly dominant. This was not the diminished, fragmented landscape that supports today's wildlife. This was a world as rich and wild as any on Earth, a world in which a human being was not the master of the environment but a participant in it, One species among many, more clever than most, but far from invulnerable. If you could stand on the ridge where Karahan Tepe now sits, 12,000 years ago, and look out over the landscape below, you would see something that no human being alive today has ever seen. You would see the world before agriculture, before fences and furrows, before the partitioning of the land into mine and yours, before the slow replacement of wild diversity with cultivated uniformity. You would see a landscape shaped entirely by natural forces, by water and wind and the movement of animals, and inhabited by human beings who had not yet begun to reshape it according to their own designs. This is the landscape that produced Karahan Tepe, a land of abundance, a place where hunter-gatherers could find everything they needed without farming a single seed or penning a single animal. And that, as it turns out, is one of the most important things about this story, because the people who built Karahan Tepe had no pottery, no domesticated animals, no cultivated fields. They were hunters and gatherers, living off wild grain and wild game, and yet they built one of the most complex monumental sites the ancient world has ever produced, and then they buried it. In 1997, a Turkish archaeologist named Bahattin Çelik was conducting a survey in the Tek Mountains. He was affiliated with Harran University, and his work was part of a broader effort to document pre-pottery Neolithic sites in the region. This was not glamorous work. It involved long days on foot, scanning exposed bedrock and eroded slopes for the telltale signs of ancient human activity. Worked flint, obsidian flakes, fragments of carved stone. Çelik was not looking for Karahan Tepe specifically. He was looking for anything at all, and what he found, on an unnamed ridge near the Kargala district, was something that should not have been there. Protruding from the thin soil, visible even without excavation, were the tops of T-shaped stone pillars. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, scattered across the hilltop and down the adjacent slopes, covering an area of roughly 10 hectares, with another 5 hectares of quarrying zones nearby, where the pillars had been carved from the living rock. The significance of this discovery was immediately apparent, because Çelik knew what T-shaped pillars meant. Just a few years earlier, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt had begun excavating a hilltop some 46 kilometers to the northwest, a site that would come to be called Göbekli Tepe, and that would fundamentally reshape the world's understanding of human prehistory. Schmidt first visited the hilltop in 1994, recognizing its significance, and formal excavations began in 1995. Göbekli Tepe had T-shaped pillars too, enormous ones, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing 10 to 20 tons, arranged in great circular enclosures and decorated with elaborate carvings of animals, foxes, snakes, vultures, boars, lions. The site dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, making it the oldest known megalithic complex on Earth. Older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years. Older than the Great Pyramids by 7,000. Older, in fact, than agriculture itself. And now here was Çelik, standing on another hilltop looking at what appeared to be the same kind of site. Perhaps older, perhaps larger, perhaps stranger. Initial surface surveys in 2000 and 2011 confirmed the scope of the find. Over 600 small artifacts were recovered, stone tools, flint blades, obsidian flakes, arrowheads, but the real discovery was architectural. Hundreds of T-shaped pillars, many still partially buried, some carved with animal figures, some with what appeared to be human forms. The site was clearly pre-pottery Neolithic, dating to somewhere between 10,000 and 9,500 BCE. But there was a problem that still haunts this story: funding. Karahan Tepe sat on dusty mountain roads far from any major population centre, with no infrastructure, no visitor facilities, and no institutional champion of the kind that Göbekli Tepe had in Klaus Schmidt and the German Archaeological Institute. Systematic excavation did not begin until 2019, under the direction of Professor Necmi Karul of Istanbul University. By that time, 2 decades had passed. The pillars had waited in the ground for 100 centuries. They could wait a little longer, but the questions they raised could not. Here is a number that should make you pause. As of the most recent excavation season, approximately 5% of Karahan Tepe has been excavated. 5%. That means 95% of the site, its structures, its carvings, its artifacts, its stories, remains buried beneath the limestone ridge, waiting. And yet even that sliver has been enough to overturn assumptions that stood for a century. What Carroll and his team have uncovered is not a single building. It is not a temple. It is not a village in any conventional sense. It's a complex of interlinked enclosures, some carved directly into the bedrock of the ridge, others constructed with external masonry walls, others combining both techniques in ways that suggest a long history of construction, modification, and reuse. The enclosures vary dramatically in size and apparent function. Some are intimate, claustrophobic even, carved deep into the rock like chambers in a natural formation. Others are expansive, open to the sky, with benches running around the perimeter as though designed for groups of people to sit and observe something happening in the centre. Take the enclosure that archaeologists have designated Structure AB. It is a small chamber, dug into the hillside, containing a series of pillars that have been interpreted as phallic in form. They rise from the bedrock floor like standing figures, and at one end of the chamber a carved human head gazes out from the stone wall. The bearded face with a serpent's body that has become one of the most reproduced images from the site. The atmosphere of this room, even in photographs, is oppressive. It feels underground even when it isn't. It feels enclosed even in the open air. Whatever happened here happened in a space that was designed to feel separate from the world above. Then there is Structure AD, one of the largest enclosures uncovered so far, which more closely resembles the great circular buildings of Göbekli Tepe. Large pillars surround a central space, with two smaller attached rooms that may represent a division between public and private function. One of the T-shaped pillars in this enclosure bears carved human arms and hands. Four-fingered hands, a detail that recurs across the broader Tash-Tapila cultural network and that no one has convincingly explained. A rock-cut channel runs between several of the enclosures, possibly for the movement of water, ceremonial, practical, or both. And then there is Structure AA, a deep pit with benches carved around its perimeter, like the seating in a small amphitheatre. This is a place where people gathered to watch. But to watch what? A ritual? A performance? A sacrifice? The stone doesn't say. It only shows us that the space was built for witnessing, and that whoever designed it understood the power of an audience. What all of these structures share is a quality that is difficult to convey in words, but unmistakable in person. They are not haphazard. They are not improvised. They are the product of planning, of coordinated labour, of a vision that extended beyond the needs of a single season or a single generation. The quarries where the pillars were carved are visible on the western slope of the hill, some still containing half-finished monoliths that were abandoned mid-work. The effort required to carve a single T-shaped pillar from limestone bedrock, using nothing but stone tools, would have been immense. To carve hundreds of them, to move them into position, to build the enclosures around them, this required something that hunter-gatherer societies were not supposed to have: organisation, hierarchy, a reason to build. If Göbekli Tepe is a place of animals, Karahan Tepe is a place of humans. That distinction, which has become clearer with each excavation season, may be the most important difference between the two sites. At Göbekli Tepe, the T-shaped pillars are dominated by animal imagery. Foxes, cranes, vultures, scorpions, snakes, wild boar, the creatures of the surrounding landscape rendered in low and high relief, sometimes with extraordinary naturalism, sometimes in postures that seem to tell a story. Human imagery at Göbekli Tepe is rare and usually abstract, arms carved on the flat faces of pillars, suggesting that the pillars themselves may represent stylized human forms, but without faces, without individuality, without the specificity of portraiture. Karahan Tepe reverses this emphasis. Here, the human form is everywhere, and it is not abstract. The most striking discovery came in September 2023, when archaeologists at Karahan Tepe uncovered a statue unlike anything previously found at a Neolithic site of this age. It is a seated male figure, carved from limestone, standing 2.3 meters tall. The figure is naked, his ribs are visible, individually carved as deep incised lines running down his torso. His spine is articulated. His hands grasp his phallus, which is prominently displayed. Around his neck is a V-shaped collar, carved in a style that closely echoes a much older find. The Urfa Man, a sandstone statue discovered during construction work in Şanlıurfa in 1993, which at 1.8 meters tall was, at the time, the oldest known large-scale human sculpture. The Karahan Tepe figure is larger, more detailed, and more anatomically explicit. Who is this person? The archaeological record does not say, but the presentation of the body, The visible ribs, the gaunt torso, the emphasis on male anatomy has prompted a range of interpretations. Some researchers see a figure at the boundary of life and death, a body in which the signs of mortality are made visible even as the signs of generative power are foregrounded. Fertility and decay held together in a single image. Others have suggested a connection to ancestor veneration, a depiction of a specific individual rendered in stone to preserve their presence after death. In a 2025 essay, independent rock art researcher Martin van Hoek proposed a comparative interpretation, describing the statue as the oldest known example of what he termed a carcantia, a figure that embodies the duality of life and death, a concept found in much later cultures across the ancient Americas. The parallel is speculative, spanning thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, but the visual echo between the Karahan Tepe figure and later Andean depictions of the living dead is striking enough to deserve mention. And this statue is not alone. In the same excavation season, a carved vulture figure was found. In 2025, archaeologists uncovered a stone figurine with stitched lips, a mouth that has been deliberately sealed. The purpose remains unknown, but based on the mortuary context, some researchers suggest it could represent the silence of death, or perhaps a ritual prohibition on speech. A black serpentinite bead was found with expressive human faces carved on both sides, a miniature double portrait polished to a soft sheen, small enough to wear against the skin, and then, in October 2025, the human face on the T-shaped pillar, the one we began with, the portrait that stared back across 11 millennia. Nekmi Karel has described the growing catalogue of human imagery at Karahan Tepe as evidence of a cognitive transformation, a moment in which human communities began to place themselves, rather than the natural world, at the centre of their symbolic universe. As communities became more sedentary, he has argued, people gradually distanced themselves from nature and placed the human figure and the human experience at the centre of existence. If this interpretation holds, then Karahan Tepe may mark one of the earliest moments in human history when people began to think of themselves as distinct from the landscape they inhabited, not as one animal among many, but as something set apart. This is not a small shift. This is the hinge on which everything turns. But the human form at Karahan Tepe is not always fully human, and it is in the places where the human and the animal blur together that this story becomes something more than archaeology. It becomes a window into a way of thinking so ancient that it precedes every civilization we have a name for. Among the carved figures at the site, a recurring motif stands out, a figure that is part human and part animal. The animal component appears to be a leopard, the apex predator of this region for tens of thousands of years, surviving in Anatolia into the 20th century before being driven to the edge of extinction. One remarkable find shows what has been interpreted as a human figure carrying a leopard on its back, though it is equally possible that the leopard is emerging from the human, or consuming the human, or becoming the human. The ambiguity appears intentional. The boundary between person and predator is deliberately unclear. This matters because the Anatolian leopard was not merely an animal to the people who built these enclosures. It was a symbol of power, of danger, of a wildness that could not be fully tamed. Thousands of years later, at the Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, the leopard would appear again. Leopard skin garments, leopard reliefs, a ceramic figure of a woman seated between two leopards. The archaeologist James Mellart, who first excavated Çatalhöyük in the 1960s, interpreted what he found as evidence of a cult of the leopard, a symbolic system in which the leopard served as a mediator between the human world and something beyond it. Later researchers have debated the specifics of Mellart's interpretation, but the prominence of leopard imagery at Çatalhöyük is beyond question. Whether the roots of that cult stretch all the way back to Karahan Tepe is a question that remains open. But the resonance is difficult to ignore, and then there is the broader pattern. The hybrid figure, half human, half animal, is not unique to Anatolia. It is one of the oldest and most persistent motifs in the entire history of human symbolic thought. And to understand what it might mean at Karahan Tepe, we need to travel much further back in time and much further afield in space. Let us leave Karahan Tepe for a moment. Let us travel west and north, through thousands of kilometers and tens of thousands of years, to a cave in southern Germany. In 1939, on the 25th of August, a geologist named Otto Wölsing was excavating in a cave called Höhlensteinstädel, in the lone valley of the Swabian Jura. It was a systematic dig directed by Robert Wetzel of the University of Tübingen, and it had been underway for 2 seasons. But on that day, just 1 week before the outbreak of the Second World War, Wölzing made a discovery that would not be understood for decades. He found fragments of carved mammoth ivory scattered across the floor of a chamber deep inside the cave, some 30 metres from the entrance. The fragments were collected, but the start of the war meant that fieldwork was abandoned and analysis never undertaken. The pieces ended up at the nearby museum Ulm, where they lay forgotten for nearly 30 years. It was not until the late 1960s that archaeologist Joachim Hahn began sorting through them, piecing together more than 200 individual shards of ivory. What emerged was a figure unlike anything that had been seen before, a being with the body of a human and the head of a cave lion, standing upright, arms at its sides, legs slightly apart. Its posture is alert, its gaze is directed forward, it is watching, it is listening. It stands 31.1 centimetres tall, small enough to hold in 2 hands, and it is, by carbon dating of the surrounding sediment layer, between 35,000 and 41,000 years old, the Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel. The oldest confirmed figurative sculpture ever discovered. Consider what this means. This was not a representation of something seen. No creature walked the earth with a lion's head and a human's body. This was a representation of something imagined, a being that existed only in the space between perception and invention. The person who carved this figure was not recording the world as it was. They were creating a world that existed only in thought and making it permanent in material form. Think about what it took to make this object. Experimental archaeologist Wolf Hein replicated the process using authentic stone tools with assistance from Museum Ulm curator Kurt Wehrberger. Removing the base of the mammoth tusk, just the raw material preparation, took 10 hours. The body was shaped with a steep-fronted scraper that required constant resharpening. Separating the torso from the inner surfaces of the arms demanded difficult cutting across the grain of the ivory, often requiring 2 hands on the tool. The basic shaping alone took roughly 200 hours. Adding the fine details, eyes, nose, mouth, ears, the incised lines on the left arm, brought the total to more than 370 hours of focused work, and that estimate does not include polishing. More than 370 hours, in a world without agriculture, without surplus, without any of the economic infrastructure that is supposed to make specialised labour possible. Weeks upon weeks in which a skilled artisan contributed nothing to the immediate survival of the group. No hunting, no gathering, no firewood, no shelter. The community had to sustain this person for all of that time, while they did nothing but carve an image of a being that did not exist in nature. This tells us something that no amount of stone tools or animal bones can tell us. It tells us that these people valued something beyond survival, that they were willing to invest a significant portion of their collective resources in an object that served no practical purpose, that could not be eaten, could not keep anyone warm, could not kill a prey animal, an object whose only function was meaning. Jill Cook of the British Museum described the chamber where the Lion Man was found as a space that was not suited for habitation. No one lived there. The cave floor showed minimal evidence of the kind of debris that accumulates in a living space. Instead, the Lion Man had been placed deliberately in the darkness of the inner chamber, accompanied by bone tools, worked antlers, and jewellery made from perforated animal teeth. Hidden, stored, kept apart from the ordinary world, in a space reserved for something extraordinary. Cook suggested that Stadel Cave may have been used occasionally as a gathering place, a site where people came together around a fire to share a particular understanding of the world, articulated through beliefs, symbolised in sculpture, and acted out in rituals. If this interpretation is correct, it would make the Lion Man among the oldest known evidence not just for art, not just for figurative representation, but for organised spiritual practice, for the deliberate creation of a space and an object devoted to the invisible, the imagined, the transcendent, and that space, dark, enclosed, set apart from the world of daylight and survival, echoes forward through the millennia, all the way to the underground chambers of Karahan Tepe. Hold that resonance in your mind. We will return to it. Now travel southwest, to the foothills of the Pyrenees in the Ariège department of France, to a system of 3 caves formed by the river Volpe near the commune of Montesquieu-Aventais. In 1912, Henri Beguin, and his 3 teenage sons, Max, Jacques, and Louis, discovered the first of these caves, Duc d'Audubert, while exploring along the riverbank. 2 years later, in 1914, the sons and 2 friends found their way into a second cave, which would be named Trois-Freres, the 3 brothers, in their honour. In the 1920s, the renowned prehistorian Abbé Henri Breuil began his survey of the cave's interior. What Breuil found in a deep chamber called the sanctuary was extraordinary. The walls were covered with engravings, some 280 animal figures, overlapping and intertwining: bison, horses, stags, reindeer, ibex, mammoths. The accumulation of images suggested a space that had been used for generations, each visit adding to the visual record of the animals that sustained these Magdalenian people. The artworks date to the mid-Magdalenian period, roughly 14,000 years ago, or approximately 12,000 BCE. But above them all, perched on a natural ledge some 4 meters above the cave floor, Breuil identified a figure that would become one of the most debated images in the history of art. A small painting, both pigmented and engraved into the rock, depicting a being that defied easy description. It had the antlers of a stag, the face of an owl, or perhaps a deer, with round staring eyes. The body was human in outline but hunched forward, the arms raised and bent. The legs were drawn as though in motion. Breuil himself described the feet as performing steps reminiscent of a dance. And below the bushy tail, which resembled that of a wolf or horse, was a male organ, emphasized but not erect, pointing backward. Breuil called it the sorcerer, and the name stuck because it implied something that resonated deeply with researchers: the idea that this figure represented not a god or a spirit, but a person wearing a costume, a person in the act of transformation, a shaman. There has been debate about Breuil's rendering. Modern photographs of the cave wall show a less distinct image than his famous sketch, and some scholars have suggested that he may have incorporated natural features of the rock into his drawing, creating a more elaborate figure than the original painters intended. But even the most conservative readings of the image acknowledge that something human and something animal are combined in this figure, and that combination, as at Hohensteinstadel as at Karahan Tepe, points to a way of thinking about the world that runs like a deep current through human prehistory. Now hold these images together. The Lion Man of Germany, 40,000 years old. The Sorcerer of Trois-Freres, 14,000 years old. The leopard-human hybrids of Karahan Tepe, 11,000 years old. These are not isolated curiosities. They are points on a line that runs through at least 30,000 years of human symbolic thought, across continents and cultures, through ice ages and warmings, through the extinction of megafauna and the birth of agriculture. And that line, wherever it appears, seems to point toward the same thing: transformation, the crossing of boundaries, the idea that a human being can become something other than what they are. The South African archaeologist David Lewis Williams spent much of his career developing a theory to explain this pattern. His argument, drawing on ethnographic evidence from San Bushman communities in southern Africa and on neurological research into altered states of consciousness, was that the human-animal hybrid figure is rooted in the experience of the shaman, in shamanic traditions around the world, from the birch forests of Siberia to the rainforests of the Amazon, from the deserts of Australia to the ice fields of the Arctic. A recurring pattern emerges. A person enters an altered state of consciousness through fasting, through rhythmic drumming, through the ingestion of psychoactive substances, through extended periods of sensory deprivation. In that altered state, the person experiences a dissolution of the boundary between self and world. They feel themselves becoming an animal. They feel the animal's power entering their body. They travel, in this transformed state, to a realm beyond the physical, a spirit world, an underworld, a sky world, where they negotiate with forces that govern the health and fortune of their community. Lewis Williams's theory is not universally accepted. Some archaeologists argue that it imposes modern ethnographic categories onto ancient people whose inner lives we can never truly know. But the pattern it identifies is difficult to dismiss. The hybrid figure appears too widely, too consistently, and across too great a span of time and space to be accidental. And at Karahan Tepe, the architectural evidence is at least consistent with the idea that altered states of consciousness played a role in whatever happened in those enclosures. The small enclosed chambers carved into bedrock, the deep pits with viewing benches, the carved faces that watch from the walls. These are not open-air gathering places. They are spaces designed to contain and concentrate experience. Spaces where, if Lewis Williams' framework has any bearing this far back, the boundary between the ordinary world and something else could be deliberately thinned. To understand what those enclosed spaces might have done to the people inside them, we need to consider something that archaeology has only recently begun to take seriously: sound. In the 1990s, researchers from Princeton University's PEER laboratory, a unit that studied anomalous phenomena, which gives some mainstream scientists reason for caution, though the acoustic measurements themselves have been cited by subsequent researchers, measured the acoustic properties of 6 megalithic structures in the United Kingdom and Ireland, including the Great Passage Tomb of Newgrange. Their findings, published in 1995, revealed a consistent pattern: strong acoustic resonance in the 95 to 120 Hz frequency band. Newgrange's inner chamber peaked at approximately 110 Hz. The consistency was striking. Despite variations in the size and shape of the chambers, they all resonated in the same narrow range, 110 Hz, a deep, low hum just within the bass range of a male voice. It is a frequency that the human body does not just hear, it feels. Preliminary laboratory research has suggested that sustained exposure to sound in the 110 Hz range may affect brain activity, potentially shifting electrical impulses toward right hemisphere processing, the region associated with spatial awareness, emotional processing, and what some researchers call holistic cognition. The findings remain early stage, but the implication is provocative. Sounds at this frequency could alter how the brain processes reality. They could make the boundary between self and environment feel less solid. On the Mediterranean island of Malta, the subterranean complex known as the Hal-Saflieni Hypogeum, a Neolithic structure dating to roughly 4000 BCE, thousands of years later than Karahan Tepe, but built within the same broad tradition of underground ritual architecture, was found to produce a double resonance frequency at 70 Hz and 114 Hz. A deep male voice tuned to these frequencies stimulated a resonance phenomenon throughout the entire underground structure. When archaeologist Fernando Coimbra stood inside during testing, he reported feeling the sound crossing his body at high speed, followed by a deep sensation of relaxation. On repetition, he described the sound seeming to bounce from his own body to the ancient red ochre paintings on the walls. Sound echoed for as long as 8 seconds. Inside those chambers, in the dark, with the bones of the dead nearby and the low hum reverberating through stone and flesh alike, the experience would have been overwhelming, and the researchers who studied the hypogeum concluded that these acoustic properties were unlikely to be accidental. Radio frequency spectrum engineer Glenn Kreisberg observed that the ceiling of the oracle chamber appeared to be intentionally carved into the form of a waveguide, a structure that channels and amplifies sound waves. The curved walls, the corbelled ceilings, the carved niches that concentrated the acoustic effect. All of these, the research team argued, point to design decisions made 5,000 years ago by people who had learned, through observation and practice, what sound could do inside stone. No acoustic study has yet been conducted at Karahan Tepe specifically. The enclosures are still being excavated, still being stabilized, still being understood. But the architecture invites the question. Consider structure AB, the small chamber carved into the bedrock with its phallic pillars and its carved head gazing from the wall. It is enclosed. It is partially subterranean. Its walls are curved. Its ceiling is low. Based on what we know from acoustically tested sites of similar construction, it seems likely that a low rhythmic chant performed inside such a space, the kind of drone that shamanic traditions worldwide use to induce trance, would resonate powerfully. The stone would catch it, amplify it, send it reverberating through the enclosed space and through the bodies of those within it. At Sayburz, another Tash Tepela site 60 kilometers east of the Euphrates, archaeologists uncovered a circular communal structure 14 meters in diameter, carved into bedrock with a long bench running along the wall. A stone-walled chamber of that size, partially subterranean, would almost certainly amplify and contain the human voice in ways that an open-air space never could. The builders may not have understood the physics of resonance, but they would have noticed, as anyone who has ever hummed inside a cave has noticed, that certain spaces make certain sounds feel different, bigger, deeper, more than human. And once they noticed, it is reasonable to assume they built for it, that they carved their chambers to specific dimensions, with specific curves, with specific surfaces, not because they had equations, because they had ears. It was at Saburs that one of the most remarkable discoveries in the entire Taş-Tepeler network came to light. In 2021, during the first season of excavation, archaeologist Aylem Özdoğan of Istanbul University uncovered a carved bench inside the communal building. The carvings on it stopped her in her tracks. The relief stretches 3.7 metres along the face of the bench, roughly 12 feet. 5 figures are carved into it, arranged in 2 scenes that appear to be meant to be read together. On the left, a human figure faces a bull. The man's left hand is raised and open, and it has 6 fingers, a detail whose significance remains unexplained. His right hand holds what appears to be a snake or a rattle. His body shows a phallic extension at the abdomen. The bull faces him, horns forward, its dangerous parts, teeth, horns, rendered with care. On the right, a second scene. Another human figure, this one carved almost in 3 dimensions, projecting out from the stone so dramatically that he seems to step into the room. He sits or stands between 2 leopards whose mouths are open, teeth visible, long tails curled up toward their bodies. One leopard has a penis, the other does not. The man holds his own phallus with his right hand. He stares not to the side like the other figures, but directly forward, out of the wall, into the room, into the eyes of whoever sat on the bench opposite. Özdoğan described this as the earliest known depiction of a narrative scene in the Near East, not a collection of individual images, not decorative motifs arranged for visual effect, a story. 2 scenes that relate to each other, with characters, with action, with a direction of reading. A visual tale carved into the backrest of a bench in a communal building 11,000 years ago. What is the story about? No one alive can say with certainty. But the elements are suggestive. A man confronting a bull, the most dangerous prey animal in the landscape. Another man flanked by leopards, the most dangerous predators. The emphasis on male anatomy, on danger, on the proximity of human and animal. These are not domestic scenes. They are not records of daily life. They feel, to every researcher who has studied them, like myth, like a foundational story about the relationship between humans and the wild world around them. A story that the community gathered around, literally, on the benches that surrounded it, and that the carved images kept alive in the absence of writing. Özdoğan wrote that the reliefs could be understood as a reflection of a collective memory that kept the values of its community alive. Professor Carroll, in a separate comment, suggested that the Taş-Tepeler gathering places existed precisely for this purpose, to perpetuate the culture's myths. The stone did what the voice alone could not. It held the story still. To understand the depth of the symbolic vocabulary these communities possessed, it helps to look closely at one specific object. Pillar 43, in enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe. This single carved stone has been studied for decades, and it remains one of the most intensely debated images in the archaeology of early belief systems. The pillar is covered in carved figures, a vulture, wings spread, appearing to carry or present a circular object, interpreted variously as the sun, a skull, a cosmic body. Below the vulture, a headless human figure, its body rendered in an angular, almost geometric style. A scorpion, massive and detailed, looms nearby. Other animals surround the central scene: birds, serpents, a fox, creatures that seem to inhabit the margins of a narrative whose central meaning remains elusive. Researchers who have applied shamanic frameworks to Pillar 43 read it as a depiction of the spirit journey. The headless figure is the shaman, whose body has been symbolically killed, the death of the self that precedes transformation. The vulture is the spirit vehicle, the animal form that the shaman assumes for the journey to the other world. The scorpion is a guardian or a guide. The circular object may represent the destination, the source of light, the place of the ancestors, the cosmic centre. Whether this reading is correct, no one can say with certainty, but it offers a framework for understanding the imagery at Karahan Tepe as well. The leopard-human hybrids, the phallic figures, the carved faces watching from walls. These may not be portraits or decorations. They may be elements of a visual narrative depicting the stages of a journey that the ritual specialist undertook on behalf of the community. The ethnographic record offers vivid parallels. Among the Olmec civilization of ancient Mesoamerica, shamans were believed to transform into jaguars, the apex predator of their environment, just as the leopard was the apex predator of Neolithic Anatolia, among the Tungus peoples of Siberia, from whom the word shaman itself derives. The spirit journey involved assuming the form of a bird, a deer or a bear, and travelling through layers of a cosmic tree that connected the underworld, the middle world, and the upper world. In every case, the shaman's journey follows a common structure. Preparation, through fasting, drumming, chanting, or the use of substances. Transformation, the symbolic death of the human self and the assumption of the animal form. Journey, the crossing of boundaries, the navigation of dangers, the arrival at the destination. Return, the bringing back of knowledge, healing or prophecy for the benefit of the community. And commemoration, the marking of the journey in art, in story and architecture. At Karahan Tepe, there is suggestive evidence for all of these stages. The preparation may have taken place in the smaller enclosed chambers. The transformation may have been enacted in the larger enclosures, with the community watching from the benches. The journey was depicted on the pillars, and the commemoration was the building itself, the enclosure, constructed and carved as a permanent record of the journeys that had taken place within it. It should be noted that the archaeological record has not yet yielded direct evidence of psychoactive substance use at these specific sites, though such practices are widely documented in later prehistoric and ethnographic contexts across the Near East and beyond. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly when only 5% of the site has been excavated. What can be said with confidence is that the architecture was designed for performance, for spectacle, for the enactment of something that required witnesses, required preparation, required a stage. There is a darker thread woven through this story, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. At Göbekli Tepe, 3 partially preserved human skulls were found among the fill material of the enclosures. A study published in the journal Science Advances described them as bearing artificial modifications, deep incisions along the sagittal axis, a drilled perforation in one case, traces of red ochre in another, of a type previously unknown from any Neolithic site or ethnographic record. The researchers described this as evidence for a previously undocumented form of skull cult. The skulls had been marked, perhaps for display, perhaps for hanging. The grooved lines could have held cords. This is not an isolated finding. The treatment of human skulls in the pre-pottery Neolithic is one of the most extensively documented ritual practices of the period. At Jericho, Kathleen Kenyon found plastered skulls, actual human skulls with the features modelled in plaster and the eyes inlaid with shell, creating portraits of the dead that were kept in the houses of the living. At Tel Karamel in northern Syria, skulls were found buried in deliberate deposits beneath the floors of communal buildings. At Naval Achori, another T-pillar site near Karahan Tepe that was later submerged beneath a reservoir, skulls were found in contexts suggesting deliberate curation and display. And then there is Çayönü. Karahan Tepe is a Neolithic settlement located in the Diyarbakir province of southeastern Turkey, roughly 200 kilometers northeast of Karahan Tepe. It was excavated for 16 seasons between 1964 and 1991, primarily by Robert John Braidwood and Halit Shamble, and later by Mehmet Özdoğan. The settlement spans the critical transition period from the pre-pottery Neolithic A to the pottery Neolithic. Çayönü is possibly the place where the pig was first domesticated. Genetic studies of Emma wheat have traced the earliest domestication of that staple crop to the slopes of nearby Mount Karakada. But Çayönü is most famous, or infamous, for a structure called the Skull Building. Over the course of its long use, the Skull Building accumulated the remains of approximately 400 individuals, women, men, and children, their skulls and long bones disarticulated and deposited in a series of cellars and upper rooms. The structure was rebuilt multiple times, suggesting that the practice it served continued for generations. An analysis of residues on a large flat stone within the building suggested the presence of human blood. Whether this represents evidence of sacrifice, of funerary defleshing, or of some other ritual practice remains debated. The archaeologists who excavated the site were careful to note that the evidence does not conclusively prove human sacrifice, but it does not exclude it either. The anthropological context offers one possible explanation. In small-scale societies, where everyone knows everyone, social cohesion is maintained through personal relationships. But as communities grow beyond roughly 150 individuals, what the anthropologist Robin Dunbar has called the natural limit of human social networks, new mechanisms are needed to bind people together. Shared ritual, shared spectacle, shared participation in acts of great symbolic weight. The broader cultural network of which Karahan Tepe was a part, the Tash Tepele, the Stone Hills, was a network in which the boundary between the living and the dead was actively managed, ritually maintained, and architecturally expressed. Here is the paradox at the heart of Karahan Tepe, the paradox that gives this video its name. For most of the 20th century, the standard model of human social evolution went something like this. First came hunter-gatherers, small mobile bands of people who followed the food. Then came agriculture, the domestication of plants and animals, which allowed people to settle in one place and accumulate surplus. Then came social complexity, hierarchy, specialisation, religion, monumental architecture, and eventually the state. The Australian-born archaeologist V. Gordon Childe formalised this model in the 1930s under the term Neolithic Revolution, and it became the framework within which virtually all discussions of early civilization took place. Karahan Tepe breaks this model completely. The faunal remains are overwhelmingly from wild species. The plant remains are from wild grains. There is no pottery. These were hunter-gatherers, and yet they built monumental architecture that rivals anything produced by the earliest farming civilizations. This should not have been possible according to the old model. Monumental construction requires surplus. Surplus requires agriculture. The chain of causation was supposed to run in one direction, farming first, then temples. But at Karahan Tepe, the temples came first. The site was occupied for approximately 1,500 years, between roughly 9,400 and 8,000 BCE. During that span, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture was beginning in the surrounding region, but it had not yet been completed. Karahan Tepe sits precisely on the hinge of that transition, and it suggests that the transition itself was driven not by material necessity, but by something else entirely, by an idea. In 1994, the French archaeologist Jacques Cauvin published a book that would prove remarkably prescient. Its title, in the original French, was Naissance des divinités, Naissance de l'agriculture, The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture. The English translation by the archaeologist Trevor Watkins appeared in 2000. Cauvin's argument was simple, elegant, and deeply controversial. He rejected the materialist explanations for the agricultural revolution that had dominated archaeological thinking for decades. The idea that environmental change, population pressure, or geographic advantage had forced people into farming. Instead, he argued that the Neolithic revolution was fundamentally an intellectual transformation, a restructuring of the human mentality expressed first in symbolic activities, in art, in ritual, in the construction of sacred spaces, and only later in economic ones. In Cauvin's view, the revolution in symbols came before the revolution in subsistence. People did not start building temples because they had started farming. They started farming because they had already undergone a transformation in the way they thought about themselves and their world. When Cauvin first published this argument, Göbekli Tepe had not yet been excavated and Karahan Tepe was entirely unknown, and yet his theory reads, in retrospect, as though it were written with these sites in mind. Here were monumental religious complexes built by pre-agricultural people at precisely the time and place where agriculture would later emerge. Ian Hodder, the British archaeologist who spent decades excavating Çatalhöyük, came to a similar conclusion from a different direction. Hodder argued that the Enlightenment distinction between sacred and profane, the idea that religious life and everyday life occupied separate spheres, was meaningless in the Neolithic. At Çatalhöyük, every house was sacred. Ritual was not something that happened in special places at special times, it was woven into the fabric of daily existence. Applied to Karahan Tepe, this insight suggests that the enclosures were not temples in any modern sense. They were venues for the full range of human social life. Performance, teaching, feasting, mourning, negotiating, competing, remembering. If people gathered at Karahan Tepe and its sister sites in large numbers, they needed to eat, and if they ate, they almost certainly drank. What they drank may have changed the world. In 1953, the archaeobotanist Carl Sauer posed a question at what became known as the Braidwood Symposium. Could the discovery of fermentation have been the spark that triggered the domestication of cereals? The participants at that symposium, led by Robert Braidwood himself, the same archaeologist who would later excavate Sayonu, came to a surprising consensus. Early grain crops, they agreed, would have been far better suited to the production of gruel or beer than bread. The tough glooms of primitive domesticated grains adhered stubbornly to the kernel, making flour production difficult. But those same grains, when soaked and allowed to ferment, would have produced a thick, mildly alcoholic porridge that was nutritious, easy to consume and, crucially, pleasurable. The idea was provocative but unprovable, until the evidence began to accumulate. In 2018, a team led by archaeologist Li Liu of Stanford University analysed 3 stone mortars from Rekhefet Cave in the Carmel Mountains of Israel, a Nasufian burial site dating to between 13,700 and 11,700 years ago. The Nasufians were semi-sedentary hunter-gatherers, the immediate cultural predecessors of the Neolithic revolution. What Liu found in the stone mortars was residual starch and phytoliths, consistent with the malting and fermentation of wheat and barley. The Natufians, it appeared, had been brewing a thick gruel-like beer and using it as part of their mortuary rituals to honour the dead. It was the oldest evidence of cereal-based alcohol production in the world, predating any evidence of domesticated grain by several millennia. And then there was Göbekli Tepe itself. 6 large limestone vessels, barrel-shaped and trough-shaped, were found in situ at the site, some with capacities of up to 160 litres. These were not portable containers. They were built into the architecture of specific rooms like fixtures. When chemist Martin Zarnkow of the Technical University of Munich's Weihenstephan Research Centre analysed the grey-black residues adhering to the lower surfaces of these vessels, he found preliminary evidence of calcium oxalate, a chemical compound that develops during the soaking, mashing and fermenting of grain. The results were not fully conclusive. The Fegel test applied was not sensitive enough for reproducible results, but they were suggestive enough to reopen the debate about the role of alcohol at the dawn of the Neolithic. Oliver Dietrich of the German Archaeological Institute summarised the implications with remarkable directness. The production and consumption of alcoholic beverages, he wrote, was an important factor in feasts facilitating the cohesion of social groups, and in the case of Göbekli Tepe, in organising collective work. What does this mean for Karahan Tepe? Multiple fireplaces have been found within structures at the site, an unusual feature that Professor Carroll described as an environment encountered for the first time. Stone cooking vessels, grinding stones and animal bones are present throughout. The enclosures were not sterile ritual spaces. They were places where people ate and drank, and if the Natufians were brewing beer 1,000 years before Karahan Tepe was built, and if the builders of Göbekli Tepe were brewing beer 46 kilometres away, it would be remarkable if the people who gathered on this ridge were not doing the same. Imagine it. 100 people, maybe more, gathered on the ridge after days of walking. The grain has been ground, soaked, allowed to sit in stone vessels sunk into the floor. It has thickened into something between porridge and beer, sour, dense, mildly intoxicating. It is shared. It is consumed in a group, in a space lined with carved pillars that flicker in firelight, and as the evening deepens and the brew does its work, the chanting begins, the drumming begins, the shaman steps forward, wearing the leopard skin, and the transformation commences. Was beer the reason people first domesticated grain? Almost certainly not the only reason. But the hypothesis, first proposed at a symposium in 1953, revived by the chemical evidence of the 2000s, suggests something profound. That celebration may have preceded cultivation, that the desire to brew and feast and gather may have been among the forces that pulled human communities toward agriculture, not the other way around. There is a climate story behind Karahan Tepe that is essential to understand, because the people who built this site did not live in stable times. They lived in the aftermath of one of the most dramatic climate disruptions in the last 100,000 years. Around 10,800 BCE, just centuries before the earliest phases of construction at Karahan Tepe, the world was plunged back into glacial conditions by an event known as the Younger Dryas. For approximately 1,200 years, the warming trend that had been underway since the end of the last ice age was reversed. Temperatures dropped, glaciers advanced. In the Near East, the lush, well-watered landscape that had sustained complex hunter-gatherer cultures, like the Natufian, was suddenly transformed. Forests receded, water sources dried up. The abundant wild game that had supported large semi-sedentary communities began to thin. The Natufian culture, which had flourished in the southern Levant for roughly 2,000 years, was devastated. Sites were abandoned, communities fragmented. The elaborate burials and grinding tools and permanent architecture that had characterized the Natufian lifeway disappeared from much of the archaeological record. And then, around 9,600 BCE, the Younger Dryas ended, abruptly. Within decades, temperatures rose, precipitation returned, and the landscape of the Near East bloomed again. The rivers flowed, the marshes filled, the herds of wild game returned to the plains and hillsides. It was in this moment of recovery, this sudden return of abundance after a millennium of scarcity, that the people of southeastern Turkey began to build. The timing is not coincidental. The Younger Dryas may have been the crucible in which the social and cognitive innovations of Karahan Tepe were forged. Communities that had survived the cold period would have done so through cooperation, through the sharing of resources, the pooling of labour, the strengthening of social bonds across band boundaries. When the warming returned and abundance was restored, those communities would have had both the motivation and the organisational capacity to undertake monumental construction. Corvin argued that the revolution in symbols preceded the revolution in subsistence. But the climate record suggests a more nuanced picture. The revolution in symbols may have been a response to crisis. The gathering places, the shared rituals, the carved pillars, all of these may have begun as survival strategies, ways of binding people together during the hard years. And when the hard years ended and the good times returned, those strategies did not disappear. They were amplified. They were monumentalized. They were carved in stone. This is a pattern that repeats throughout human history. The greatest cultural achievements often emerge not from comfort, but from recovery. Not from stability, but from the memory of instability. The cathedrals of medieval Europe were built by communities that had survived plague. The Renaissance emerged from the ashes of the 14th century crisis. And the monumental architecture of the Taş Tepeler may have emerged from the memory of the Younger Dryas, from the knowledge, carried in story and symbol, that the world could end and begin again. Imagine for a moment that you're living in this region 12,000 years ago. You're a hunter-gatherer, part of a band of perhaps 30 to 50 people. Your world is the landscape, the hills, the rivers, the herds of gazelle that move across the Harran Plain in autumn. You know every watercourse, every game trail, every stand of wild incorn and emmer wheat. You move with the seasons, following the food, returning to favoured campsites where flint can be found, or where the hunting is particularly good. And then, at certain times of the year, your band meets others. On the ridge tops, at the places where the T-shaped pillars stand. You have walked for days to get here. Other bands have walked from different directions, some from the north, from the flanks of the Taurus Mountains, some from the east, from the valleys of the upper Tigris, some from the south, from the edges of the Syrian steppe. They bring with them things you cannot find at home: obsidian from central Anatolia, shells from the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, flint of a quality that your local sources cannot match. But they also bring something less tangible: stories, songs, techniques, ideas. The archaeological evidence supports this picture. Among the artefacts found at Taş Tepeler sites are obsidian fragments sourced to volcanic deposits hundreds of kilometres away in central Anatolia. Seashells from both the Mediterranean and the Red Sea have been recovered. The monumental construction at Karahan Tepe was not the work of a single isolated community. It was a regional phenomenon, involving the movement of people, materials and ideas across a wide geographic area. The archaeologist Stephen Mithen once posed a question that cuts to the heart of this mystery. Why would people voluntarily labour in the hot sun, in a pre-monetary system, to build structures of this scale? They were not paid. They were not enslaved. They could, presumably, have chosen to do something else. The answer, Mithen suggested, lies in the process rather than the product. The act of building, of carving stone together, of raising pillars together, of shaping a space together, was itself the ritual. The bonds forged in the labour, the authority established by those who directed it, the shared accomplishment of the finished enclosure, these were the real outputs. The building was a byproduct. The community was the product. But community is not always harmonious, and there are signs at Karahan Tepe and its sister sites that competition between communities, between ritual leaders, between traditions, was a powerful force in shaping the architectural landscape. Each enclosure at Göbekli Tepe appears to have been built, used for a relatively short period, and then deliberately buried, filled with rubble and debris, sealed and covered. New enclosures were then built on top of or adjacent to the old ones. At Karahan Tepe, the pattern is similar. The Necmi Karel's 2021 paper described the buried buildings of Karahan Tepe in detail, noting that all structures exposed thus far show evidence of intentional filling. Why would you build something of such immense effort and complexity, use it for a generation or two and then bury it? The answers that have been proposed are as varied as the scholars who proposed them. One possibility is that the burial was ritual, a symbolic closing of a chapter, a sealing of the sacred, a way of ending a cycle and beginning a new one. The Cucuteni Tripelia culture of southeastern Europe, which flourished in the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, practiced the ritual burning and rebuilding of entire settlements on cycles of roughly 60 to 80 years. The Ainu people of northern Japan, well into the 19th century, ritually dismantled and rebuilt their houses as part of a cycle of renewal. The idea that a building's life must end in order for a new life to begin is not unique to the Tash Tapela. It appears across the world, across millennia. Another possibility is competitive. If each enclosure was associated with a particular lineage, a particular ritual leader, a particular tradition, then the burial of an enclosure might represent the end of that lineage's dominance and the beginning of another's. A new leader, a new tradition, a new set of carvings, a new enclosure, built on the ruins of the old, asserting its primacy through sheer scale and ambition. Lee Clare of the German Archaeological Institute has described the Tash Tepela phenomenon in terms that evoke this competitive model. These sites were not isolated sacred places but nodes in a network of communities that were actively building, displaying and competing. The enclosures were statements of power, of devotion, of the ability to mobilize labour and resources. The French word for it would be potlatch, the practice found among indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, in which leaders demonstrated their status by giving away or destroying their most valuable possessions. The more you could afford to destroy, the more powerful you were. The burial of a fully constructed megalithic enclosure, filled with priceless carvings that had taken years to complete, would have been the ultimate potlatch, a gesture so extravagant that it could only be answered with an even greater one. There is a temptation, when dealing with a site as extraordinary as Karahan Tepe, to treat it as unique. This temptation should be resisted, because Karahan Tepe is one expression of a phenomenon that appears independently around the world, hunter-gatherers building monumental architecture before the advent of farming. In North America, the site of Watson Brake in northeastern Louisiana consists of 11 earthen mounds connected by ridges, forming an oval complex some 280 metres across. It was built by hunter-gatherers around 3500 BCE, more than 2,000 years before the famous mound complex at Poverty Point, which stands just 90 kilometres away. Watson Brake predates the earliest evidence of agriculture in the region by centuries. In Peru, the Norte Chico civilization, centred on the site of Corral in the Soup Valley, produced monumental architecture, including sunken circular plazas and raised platform mounds, beginning around 3000 BCE. While some early agriculture was practiced, the economy was largely based on fishing and the harvesting of wild resources. The sunken plazas at Corral bear a striking resemblance to the deep pits at Karahan Tepe, enclosed circular spaces with raised perimeters, designed for gatherings at which something significant was witnessed. In Japan, the Jomon culture flourished for an astonishing span, from roughly 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE, one of the longest continuous cultural traditions in human history. The Jomon were not farmers. They were hunters, fishers, and gatherers who lived in a landscape so abundant that agriculture was unnecessary. And yet they built stone circles, produced some of the world's oldest pottery, and developed a rich symbolic life expressed in intricate figurines and elaborate burial practices. These parallels do not require an explanation based on contact or diffusion. What they suggest is something deeper, something about the way human groups, once they reach a certain level of social complexity, tend to express that complexity in stone. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss might have called it a structural feature of the human mind. Whatever we call it, it appears to be universal, and Karahan Tepe is among its earliest and most powerful expressions. The story of Karahan Tepe cannot be told in isolation. It belongs to a network, a constellation of sites stretching across hundreds of kilometres of the northern Fertile Crescent. And two of those sites add dimensions that Karahan Tepe alone cannot provide. The first lies to the east. Bonchuklu Tala, the beaded field, sits in Mardin province, roughly 125 kilometres from Karahan Tepe, within 1.5 kilometres of the Tigris River. It was discovered during surveys ahead of the Ilisu Dam construction in 2008, and excavations began in 2012 under the direction of Dr. Ergül Kodash of Mardin Artuklu University. Bonchuklu Tala is roughly contemporaneous with Karahan Tepe and shares many of its features: communal buildings with symbolic interiors, evidence of ritualized burial, a pre-pottery toolkit. But it is also profoundly different. Covering just 2.5 hectares, it is far smaller. And where Karahan Tepe is a place of monumental stone carving, Bonchuklu Tala is a place of intimate personal adornment. Over 200,000 beads have been recovered, crafted from stone, shell, bone, mother of pearl, obsidian, and native copper. The sheer quantity is staggering. In 2024, a study published in the journal Antiquity by Dr. Emma Basel and colleagues at Ankara University reported the discovery of over 100 body ornaments found in situ beside the ears and chins of buried individuals, providing the oldest contextual evidence of ear and lip piercings in Southwest Asia. Labrets, nail-like ornaments inserted through the lower lip, showed wear patterns on the lower incisors consistent with prolonged habitual use. The ornaments were found exclusively with adults, never with children, suggesting that body piercing served as a rite of passage into adulthood, a physical marker of social identity and belonging. In late 2024, a 2.2-metre stone stele was uncovered within the remains of a public building roughly 10 metres in diameter. Associate Professor Kodash described it as the first such large stele discovered in the Upper Tigris Valley. It resembled the T-shaped pillars of the Şanlıurfa region, suggesting cultural connection. A miniature replica of the stele was found inside the same building, a model of the monument, kept close at hand, as though the image of the sacred pillar mattered as much as the pillar itself. Evidence from Bonchuklu Tala even suggests copper was being cold-worked as early as 8,500 BCE, millennia before the conventionally dated beginnings of metallurgy. The second site lies to the west. In North Yorkshire, England, beneath farmland at the eastern end of the Vale of Pickering, lies Starcar, the most important Mesolithic site in Britain. It dates to approximately 9,000 BCE, roughly the same centuries in which Karahan Tepe was being built, though the two communities had no conceivable knowledge of each other. Among the finds are 33 antler headdresses. These are the skulls of red deer stags, with the antlers still attached, carefully worked, the lower jaw and cranial bones removed, the frontal bone perforated with holes, the interior smoothed. Research published by Dr. Amy Little and colleagues at the University of York revealed that fire was used in their manufacture. The skulls were packed with damp clay and placed in beds of embers. The deer these skulls came from were roughly 50% larger than their modern descendants. What were these headdresses for? Professor Ronald Hutton of the University of Bristol noted that improved technology tells us how the headdresses were made and worn, but not the purpose of their use. What we can say is that someone, 11,000 years ago, on the shore of a lake in what is now Yorkshire, was putting on the skull and antlers of a deer and becoming for a time something other than human. The same gesture, the same crossing, the same blur between person and animal that we see carved into the pillars of Karahan Tepe. Consider what it means to carve a figure in stone. A wooden figure can be burned, a drawing on skin can fade, a story told aloud can be forgotten within a generation. But a figure carved in limestone endures. It outlasts the person who made it. It outlasts the community that used it. It outlasts the language in which its meaning was first articulated. It becomes a vessel for memory, not the memory of any particular individual, but the memory of a tradition, a practice, a way of being in the world. The carvings at Karahan Tepe are not decorations, they are mnemonics, they are aids to remembering. When a shaman or ritual leader stood in one of those enclosures and performed the ceremony that the community had gathered to witness, the carvings on the pillars provided the visual framework for the performance. This animal, at this stage of the journey, accompanied by this gesture, this chant, this movement. The images encoded the sequence, they preserved the structure, they ensured that the ceremony could be repeated generation after generation, with enough fidelity to maintain its power. And when the enclosure was buried, The memory it contained was sealed along with it. Not destroyed, preserved. Placed beyond the reach of the living, like a book closed and shelved. But the tradition itself continued. New enclosures were built, new carvings were made, new performances were staged. What the builders of Karahan Tepe understood, and what we, with our permanent cities and our digital archives, sometimes forget, is that memory is not a fixed thing. It is a practice. It must be performed, renewed, and reenacted to remain alive. The carvings are not the memory itself. They are the prompts. The memory lives in the performance. In 2025, discoveries across the Tash Tepela network deepened this picture. At Sefer Tepe, a site within the same cultural orbit, archaeologists uncovered two carved human faces on neatly dressed stone blocks, one in high relief, the other in low. Their contrasting techniques and unusual proportions set them apart from previously known representations at Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe and Symbolic, suggesting that Sefer Tepe may have cultivated its own local sculptural idiom within the wider network. Each community contributed its own innovations to the shared tradition. The memory was not monolithic. It was alive, adapting, branching. A conversation in stone carried on across generations and across the landscape. Let us try now to imagine what it was like. Not the excavation, not the modern site with its visitor walkways and information panels, but the living place, the place as it was. You arrive at the ridge after a journey of several days. Your band has been walking since dawn, carrying bundles of wild grain and dried meat, trade goods wrapped in hide, obsidian blanks, seashells, pigments. You can see the other bands arriving from different directions, their fires visible on the distant hillsides as dusk falls. The air smells of limestone dust and wild thyme and the smoke of cooking fires. The ridge is crowded. There are more people here than you see at any other time of year. Hundreds, perhaps. They camp on the slopes under shelters of hide and brush, and during the day they work. Not because they are forced to, because it is what this gathering is for. The elders have directed the work. The quarrying of a new pillar, the deepening of a chamber, the carving of a figure that has been described in stories but not yet rendered in stone. You take your turn with a stone maul, feeling the limestone fracture in long, clean planes. The sound of hammering echoes across the ridge from a dozen different points. Someone, somewhere, is singing. In the evenings there are feasts. The cooking fires burn in the large enclosure, where the benches ring the central space and the carved pillars watch from the shadows. There is meat, aurochs, gazelle, wild boar, and bread made from ground wild wheat, and beer, thick and sour and mildly intoxicating, fermented in the great stone vessels sunk into the floor. The shaman presides. You have seen this figure before, the elder who wears the leopard skin, who speaks in a voice that seems to come from somewhere deeper than the body. When the fire burns low and the stars come out, the shaman begins the performance. The chanting, the drumming, the slow transformation, the human figure becoming something else, something with claws, something with eyes that see in the dark. You watch from the bench, pressed shoulder to shoulder with people you know and people you don't. The fire throws shadows on the carved pillars, the leopards, the snakes, the faceless human forms with their four-fingered hands. For a moment in the firelight, the carved figures seem to move. There are other things happening too, quieter things. In a smaller chamber, away from the main enclosure, a young person is being taught. An elder sits beside them, pointing at a carving on the wall, explaining something in a low voice. The young person traces the outline of the figure with their fingers, learning the shape, learning the story that goes with it, learning the sequence of the journey that the shaman will one day enact for a new generation. This is school. This is transmission. This is the mechanism by which a culture without writing preserves itself across centuries. Elsewhere, two men from different bands are arguing. Not violently. There is no weapons cache, no fortification, nothing to suggest that these gatherings were characterized by warfare. But intensely. Perhaps about the placement of a new pillar, or the design of a carving, or the allocation of a trade route. This is politics. This is negotiation. This is the invisible architecture of social order being built alongside the visible architecture of stone. And somewhere on the edge of the encampment, a woman is grinding grain. Wild einkorn, harvested from the hillsides below, its tiny seeds poured into the hollow of a stone mortar and crushed with a handheld pestle until they become flour. The flour will be mixed with water, and baked on the hot stones beside the fire. Bread, the simplest and most profound of human foods. The food that would, within a few centuries, become the foundation of a completely new way of life. But tonight, it is simply dinner. The woman does not know that she is standing at the beginning of something. She knows only that the grain grows wild on the slopes, and that it can be ground and baked, and that it tastes good, and that there is enough. For now, there is enough. And in the morning, you work again. You carve, you carry, you eat, you listen. And when the gathering ends and you walk back down the hill toward your distant home, you carry something with you that is more valuable than any obsidian blade or shell bead. You carry a story, a memory, a reason to come back next year. The end did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like a season changing, so gradually that the people living through it may not have recognized it as an ending at all. Somewhere in the centuries around 8,500 BCE, the balance began to shift. The wild einkorn and emmer wheat that the communities of the Tek Mountains had been harvesting for generations began to change. Not in the fields, in the practice. People began to notice that certain stands of grain were more productive than others, that grain scattered near campsites in one season sometimes grew back in the next. The first experiments in cultivation were underway. At the same time, the great herds of wild game that had sustained the hunter-gatherer lifeway were thinning. Not because of climate change, the post-Younger Dryas warming was well established by this point, but because of human pressure. Thousands of years of hunting in a landscape increasingly populated by growing communities had taken their toll, and with it, the social fabric began to change. Bands that had been mobile, moving with the seasons, gathering at the ridgetop sites for festivals and returning to their hunting grounds, began to settle, permanently, near the patches of grain they were learning to cultivate, near the water sources they were learning to manage, near the animals they were beginning, slowly, haltingly, to domesticate. The seasonal pilgrimage to the stone hills became less essential. The rituals that had bound far-flung communities together at the gathering places were supplanted by new rituals, performed at the local level, in the houses where people now lived year-round. The enclosures of Karahan Tepe did not fall into ruin. They were not abandoned to decay. They were closed, deliberately, carefully, with the same attention to process and sequence that had characterized their construction. The enclosures were filled, carefully, methodically, as with rubble and debris. The carved pillars were covered. The chambers were sealed. The hill that had been a gathering place for a millennium and a half became once again a hill. The goats returned. The dust covered the stone. The stories presumably continued for a while, and then, eventually, they too were forgotten. The backfilling of Karahan Tepe is not unique. Göbekli Tepe was buried too. Jerf El Ahmar, a contemporary site in Syria, was buried. The Ness of Brodgar in Orkney, a Neolithic complex built some 6,000 years later, was buried in a strikingly similar fashion. Wherever monumental architecture is built by pre-state societies, the architecture is eventually sealed. The practice crosses continents and millennia. But there is one possibility that haunts this story more than the others. Perhaps the burial was not closure at all. Perhaps it was care. The people who filled those enclosures with rubble knew what they were doing. They had built those structures. They had carved those pillars. They understood the labour involved, the years of work, the generations of accumulated meaning. And they chose not to leave them exposed to the elements, to the slow erosion of wind and rain. They chose to put them underground, where the stone would be protected, where the carvings would endure, where the faces would continue to stare even in total darkness. If this is true, if the burial was an act of preservation rather than abandonment, then it raises a question that is almost unbearable in its implications. Did they know? Did the people of Karahan Tepe understand on some level that the world they had built was ending? That the transition underway, from hunting to farming, from gathering to storing, from seasonal movement to permanent settlement, would make their way of life obsolete? And did they bury their greatest achievements not because they no longer valued them, but because they valued them too much to let them decay? We cannot answer this, but the irony is almost too perfect. The very act that ended Karahan Tepe's life as a living site is the act that preserved it for rediscovery. Walls that were filled with rubble and debris have survived almost intact. their carved surfaces protected from the millennia of wind and rain that eroded away so many other Neolithic monuments. The builders' care, if care it was, worked. Before we move toward the end of this story, it is worth pausing on a word that has appeared many times throughout it. Ritual. There is a running joke in archaeology that whenever a find cannot be explained by practical function, it gets labelled ritual. A carved stone whose purpose is unknown, ritual object. A building whose layout makes no sense as a dwelling, ritual structure. The joke has a point, but it also obscures something important, because human beings are, fundamentally, ritualistic animals. We are creatures who place meaning into actions that do not strictly require it. Consider your own life. The cup of coffee you make each morning, following the same steps in the same order, not because the coffee demands it, but because the routine itself provides comfort. The way you arrange objects on a shelf, or set a table for a meal, or mark the turning of the year with specific foods and specific songs. None of these things are necessary for survival. All of them are necessary for something else, for the sense that life is not merely a series of random events, but a pattern, a structure, a story with recurring motifs. This is what ritual is. Not a separate category of human behaviour, walled off from the practical and the everyday, but a quality that can be applied to any behaviour. Eating is practical. A feast is ritual. Building is practical. Carving a face on a pillar is ritual. The distinction is not in the action itself, but in the meaning invested in it. At Karahan Tepe, the presence of grinding stones and cooking hearths, within structures that also contain elaborately carved pillars, suggests that these were not temples set apart from daily life. They were spaces where the full range of human experience was enacted, where people ate and prayed and argued and mourned and celebrated and worked and dreamed, all within the same walls, all under the gaze of the same carved figures. This is perhaps the most radical thing that Karahan Tepe teaches us. Not that our ancestors were more religious than we imagined, but that they did not draw the lines we draw. They did not separate the sacred from the secular, the spiritual from the material, the meaningful from the mundane. Everything was entangled, everything carried weight. There is a line of succession that runs from Karahan Tepe forward through time, and tracing it reveals how deep the roots of later civilization truly go. At Çatalhöyük, founded around 7,500 BCE, roughly 500 years after Karahan Tepe was sealed, the tightly packed houses, the wall paintings, the bull imagery, the leopard symbolism, and the practice of burying the dead beneath the floors of the living all-echo themes that first appeared in the Taş Tepeler region. Further west, on the island of Cyprus, the Neolithic settlement of Kirokitia, founded around 7000 BCE, shows circular stone architecture that some researchers have linked to the circular enclosure tradition of the mainland. And then there is the astonishing parallel in Mesoamerica. At Aguada Fenix, in the Mexican state of Tabasco, archaeologists used airborne laser mapping to reveal an enormous raised earthen platform, nearly 1.4 kilometers long, built between roughly 1800 BCE by communities that were in the early stages of transitioning to agriculture. No sculptures of rulers or elites have been found at the site, suggesting, as lead archaeologist Takeshi Inamata of the University of Arizona has argued, that the construction was communal and largely voluntary rather than directed by a ruling class. The pattern echoes what we see at Karahan Tepe, gatherer builders creating monumental architecture before settled hierarchical life was fully established, using the act of construction itself as a social technology for binding communities together. The Maya connection runs deeper than architecture. Among the classic Maya, the shaman priest was a figure of enormous power. A person who wore animal costumes, entered trance states, communed with ancestors and spirits. When the classic Maya civilization collapsed in the 9th century CE, the great cities were abandoned, but the shamanic tradition did not die. It returned to the forests, carried by the smaller communities that survived. Shamanism is not bound to a particular level of social complexity. It works in a band of 30 and a city of 30,000. The form changes, the animals and symbols change. But the underlying structure, the journey, the transformation, the crossing, the return, endures. The concept appears to be something like cultural gravity. When human groups reach a threshold of complexity, they build, they gather, they create spaces that are larger than any single household, that require more labour than any single family can provide, that serve functions that transcend the practical. And the form those spaces take, circular, enclosed, oriented, marked with symbols of power and transformation, recurs so persistently that it begins to feel less like cultural invention and more like an inevitable expression of what it means to be human. Karahan Tepe sits near the beginning of that line. Not at the absolute beginning. The Lion Man, after all, is 30,000 years older. But at the moment where the impulse to create sacred space first found expression in architecture of permanent, monumental scale. Everything that came after, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the pyramids of Egypt, the stone circles of Britain, the temples of Greece, the cathedrals of Europe, descends in some sense from this moment. The work of uncovering Karahan Tepe has barely begun. In October 2025, ground-penetrating radar at Göbekli Tepe revealed previously unknown subsurface structures, additional circular enclosures, smaller rectangular features interpreted as possible domestic buildings, and a large rectangular structure unlike anything previously identified. The implication was immediate. Even at Göbekli Tepe, after 3 decades of excavation, the bulk of the story remains underground. At Karahan Tepe, Carol's team of 220 people began simultaneously excavating nearly 20 structures in recent seasons, quickly uncovering walls that were buried close to the surface. The preservation is extraordinary, a direct consequence of the deliberate backfilling that sealed the site around 8000 BCE. The international significance of these findings has not gone unnoticed. An exhibition at the Colosseum in Rome, running from October 2024 to March 2025, drew 6 million visitors with material from Göbekli Tepe and the Taş Tepeler sites. Further exhibitions are planned for Berlin's James Simon Gallery, for the United Kingdom in 2026, and for the Tokyo National Museum in 2027. Turkey's Culture and Tourism Minister Mehmet Nuri Ersoy has described the ambition plainly: to establish the Taş Tepeler as the world's Neolithic capital. For millennia, the stones of Karahan Tepe spoke only to the earth that covered them. Now they are speaking to the world. And now we come to the part of the story that is no longer about the past. You are lying in the dark, maybe in a bed, maybe on a couch, maybe on a train or a plane or in the back seat of a car. It is late or early or somewhere in between. The world outside is doing whatever the world does when you're not watching it. And you've been listening to a story about people who lived so long ago that the distance is almost meaningless. A span of time so vast that everything we call history fits inside it like a coin inside a canyon. And yet, the things they did, the gathering, the feasting, the building, the storytelling, the performance, the mourning of the dead, the honouring of the past, the investment in something larger than any single life, these are not alien activities. You recognise them. You have done them. You have sat in a crowd and felt the electricity of shared attention. You have built something with your hands and felt the satisfaction of making something real. You have stood at a grave and felt the weight of everything that will never be said again. The people of Karahan Tepe were the same kind of mind, working with different materials in a different landscape, facing the same fundamental questions that we face. How do we live together? How do we make meaning? How do we remember? How do we let go? Corvin called it a revolution of the mind. What was born in those limestone hills was not religion in any modern sense. What was born was the capacity, the need, to imagine something beyond the visible world, to invest labour in something that cannot be eaten or worn or wielded, to build not for survival, but for significance, to carve a face in stone and leave it staring across time, long after the hands that made it have returned to dust. That capacity is still with us. It is what sends telescopes to the edge of the universe and submarines to the bottom of the ocean. It is what builds cathedrals and writes symphonies. It is the thing that makes us restless, and the thing that makes us wonder, and the thing that keeps us awake at night asking questions that have no easy answers. Or, more often, the thing that makes us put on a video like this one and close our eyes and let someone else carry the wondering for a while. There is a particular kind of melancholy that attaches to sites like Karahan Tepe. Not the melancholy of destruction. The site was not destroyed, it was preserved. And not the melancholy of loss. The carvings endure, the pillars still stand, but the melancholy of silence, the absolute irreversible silence of a culture that left no written language, no named individuals, no recorded history of any kind. We know that these people carved stone with extraordinary skill. We do not know the name of a single carver. We know that they performed rituals of great complexity and power. We do not know the words of a single prayer, a single song, a single story that was told beside those carved pillars in the firelight. We know that they buried their greatest structures with deliberate care. We do not know the name they gave to the act of burying, or the reason they gave for it, or the emotion they felt when the last stone was placed and the earth closed over the face in the pillar. The stones are precise. The silence around them is total. And yet, the fact that we feel this absence at all, that we look at a carved face from the deep Neolithic and feel a connection, a recognition, a sense that this person was trying to communicate something that we almost understand. That fact is itself evidence. Evidence that whatever the builders of Karahan Tepe were expressing in stone, it was something universal, something that crosses the silence, something that makes us, lying in the dark on a night 11 millennia removed from theirs, feel that we are not entirely strangers. There is a question that every human being asks, sooner or later, usually in the dark, usually when the world has gone quiet. Does any of this matter? Does the effort, the building, the carving, the gathering, the labouring in the sun, does it amount to anything? Or is it all in the end buried under the same indifferent earth? The builders of Karahan Tepe did not leave us an answer, but they left us the question, carved in stone, and the fact that we are still asking it, tonight, right now, in this moment, is perhaps the only answer that matters. You may be drifting now. The rhythm of the words may be doing its work, carrying you toward the edge of sleep, toward that liminal place where thought softens into image, and image softens into dream. If so, that is exactly right. But before you go, consider one last thing. Sleep itself is a kind of burial. Every night you lay your body down, you close your eyes, you let consciousness dissolve, layer by layer, until only the deepest rhythms remain. The breath, the heartbeat, the slow electrical pulse of the dreaming brain. You enter a space that is set apart from the waking world, a space where the rules are different, where time behaves strangely, where the boundary between self and other, between present and past, between the real and the imagined, becomes porous. And every morning you rise, you return, you carry with you fragments of the place you have been, images, sensations, emotions that cling like the dust of an underground chamber, and you step back into the world slightly changed, slightly renewed. The people who built Karahan Tepe understood this rhythm, not in the language of neuroscience, but in the deeper language of experience. They understood that consciousness has layers, that the waking mind is not the only mind, that the things encountered in the dark, in the trance, in the dream, in the silence of the underground chamber, have a reality of their own. When they buried their enclosures, they were enacting the same rhythm on a civilizational scale. The descent into darkness, the sealing of the surface, the preservation of what matters in a place beyond the reach of ordinary time, and the implicit promise, never stated but always felt, that what is buried may, one day, return to the light. It has returned. After 11,000 years in the ground, the faces of Karahan Tepe are seeing daylight again. The pillars are standing, the carvings are being read, not in the language of the builders, That language is lost forever, but in a language that the builders would recognize, the language of wonder, the language of the question that has no easy answer. We began tonight with a stone emerging from the earth, a pillar that had spent 100 centuries in darkness, seeing daylight again for the first time, and a face carved by hands we will never know for reasons we can only guess, looking out at a world unimaginably different from the one in which it was made. That pillar was found in a room with grinding stones, an ordinary room, a room where meals were prepared, which means that whoever carved this face did not think of it as extraordinary. It was part of daily life. It was as natural as bread, as natural as the firelight on the walls. The rest of Karahan Tepe, the vast majority of it, is still underground. Somewhere beneath that ridge, right now, in the permanent darkness of the unexcavated earth, there are carvings that no one has seen since the last person who knew their meaning placed the final stone above them and walked away into a world that was changing faster than anyone could understand. And somewhere in the world right now, a team of archaeologists is planning the next excavation season, studying the GPR scans, mapping the anomalies, calculating where to dig. Professor Carroll once said that nothing his team encountered at Karahan Tepe would ever be the ultimate surprise, that there would always be another layer, another chamber, another figure, another question. The stones are patient. They have nowhere else to be, and neither do you. If this story stayed with you, if it carried you somewhere quiet or gave you something to wonder about as you drift, a like helps other listeners find their way here. There is a whole playlist of nights like this one waiting for you, each one a different door into the deep past. And if you have thoughts about the burial, about the leopard, about the face in the stone, leave them below. This is a conversation, not a lecture. The best ideas in these comments come from people like you, lying in the dark, thinking. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.